Hi everyone, this is Adriana Messa and welcome to Reflect on and Improve Own Professional Practice, Session 2, Personal and Professional Boundaries. It's critical for us as workers to be able to establish and maintain professional boundaries with our clients because we have duty of care requirements and ethical practice that we need to meet. So in today's session we're going to explore both personal boundaries and also the importance of professional boundaries. So let's look at what boundaries are. Boundaries provide us with a sense of personal identity and self-definition that generally remain constant regardless of ups and downs or external pressures in our lives. They promote limit setting, which help us to stay protected and also our clients to stay protected. So they're a way of delineating between us and another person, both physically, psychologically, and emotionally. In working with clients, professional boundaries are the framework within which the worker-client relationship occurs. Clients are incredibly vulnerable and highly suggestible when they come in for support because they've generally been disempowered in some way. So there is a risk that clients will blur boundaries with us, and so we need to have very clear personal boundaries and professional boundaries so that we can role model appropriate boundaries to our clients. It's a way of giving clients a sense of structure and what to expect from us as people, which reduces their anxiety. And it also protects us in terms of being able to clearly set limits with our clients about what we can and can't offer them. So let's look at different types of boundaries. Now, boundaries can be labelled as either collapsed, porous or loose boundaries, healthy and rigid. So if you picture this image, I guess, on a continuum with collapsed boundaries indicating that there's no boundaries at all, right through to the other extreme, which is having very rigid boundaries. So healthy boundaries help us to keep out unhealthy people, toxic people, and psychologically unhealthy emotions, thoughts, and beliefs. And healthy boundaries, if you can picture this, are almost like living in a room where the walls are intact. There's a solid door, there's a doorknob that's really only on the inside, and it means you can have some choice about who comes into your room and who doesn't, and also who needs to stay outside of your room. So beginning with collapsed boundaries, this gives us a sense that we have no protection at all. It's like being in a room where all the walls have crumbled, there are no doors, and so raiding parties can come and go at all hours of the day and night. So collapsed boundaries are marked by excesses generally. People with collapsed boundaries tend to get very overwhelmed emotionally, physically by work. They become mentally agitated and distressed because people will just dump on them. They might actually endure abuse of all types. So physical, sexual, financial, spiritual, psychological abuse, and then this leads to other sort of maladaptive coping, like having to rely on other people, becoming quite needy, and also even in extreme cases, having to look at external ways of coping, like substance abuse. So generally, for example, people who are in active addiction are known to have collapsed boundaries. Porous boundaries would be like living in the same room with intact walls, and a door. However, the doorknob is on the outside. So other people have the ability to control what goes in and out of your personal room. They're free to hand you their emotions to fix, their problems to solve, their opinions rule your life. Because they're free to come and go as they please, they always have the ability to throw you off course. So you're forever adjusting to someone else's plans, trying to be flexible, and generally being overly accommodating. With rigid boundaries, it's like being in a room with impenetrable walls, really thick walls. There are no windows, there are no doors. And generally people develop very rigid boundaries because of past wounding. And so they have a need to self-protect. But what this does is they might become quite emotionally distant and unavailable because of fear of being hurt. And they might experience a high level of isolation and disconnection from their own feelings and internal states of being, but also from others and the world. So on that continuum, where we're most wanting to be is with healthy boundaries versus having collapsed, porous, or rigid boundaries. So let's look at what healthy boundaries look like. Healthy boundaries allow us to be assertive, decisive, responsible, and reliable. They give us a sense of internal security. So generally, we have a good sense of self, which means we can be comfortable in our own skin and also with others. So with healthy boundaries, or people with healthy boundaries tend to be able to say no when they want without experiencing huge waves of guilt. And they do that in a really respectful way. They're very clear about what they want, how they want to achieve it, and they can be quite self-reliant rather than needy and needing to depend on others. Healthy boundaries means that you don't tend to blame other people for things that really are your responsibility, but it's also being able to not take on other people's guilt and blame as well. Healthy boundaries allow us to disagree with people while still maintaining relationships, to receive constructive feedback. Because of our sense of self, we can see the value in getting healthy feedback, and we're comfortable in giving feedback as well. In opposition to that, a lack of personal boundaries means that we'll tend to behave in passive-aggressive or aggressive ways to have our needs met. We'll tend to be indecisive and not trust ourselves or others at times. We'll blame others and expect them to take responsibility for our actions. We'll generally be insecure, and so feedback might always be received as criticism. So feedback is avoided, or you tend to become really defensive or offensive when you get feedback. You also become unaware of other people violating your boundaries. So there tends to be indiscriminate sharing and self-disclosure when you have poor boundaries. People will generally think that they're in love by the end of the first date, rather than taking the time to build trust and really understand the other person's qualities and who they are in order to build trust. So that leaves people very vulnerable to being abused and hurt. People get very overwhelmed by others. They act on impulses really quickly, like sexual impulses, or they can't cope with delaying gratification, which we know is important in life. They go against their own personal values to accommodate others or please them. And they let people define them when they have poor boundaries. So this kind of, when you have unhealthy boundaries, they're real indicators of having collapsed boundaries, which are closely correlated with having poor self-identity, a poor understanding of power and control. So rather than being assertive and doing power with people, you'll tend to do power under or power over. So being either passive or aggressive. Again, being a people pleaser and overly accommodating and subjugating your own personal needs to prioritize other people's needs. You might have completely unrealistic expectations of yourself and others. A really high tolerance to abuse and disrespect. You'll tend to absorb other people's feelings, rely on other people's opinions about yourself and what you should do, and you'll have an inability to define limits. So understandably, this becomes very problematic if you're working with clients who present with poor boundaries. If your own boundaries are not healthy and secure, then you're going to be at risk of causing harm to your clients and also yourself. So let's shift gears and look at the client-worker relationship and why boundaries are so relevant. There's an inherent power imbalance between workers in the client-worker relationship. Whilst we want to believe that we're client-focused and that empowering the client will help with that power imbalance, at the end of the day, our clients are really vulnerable and suggestible. We're professionals who they're seeking support from and comfort from. So there is that inherent power imbalance that we need to be aware of. And that informs our ability to meet our duty of care requirements. Ultimately, as workers, we are responsible for managing all boundary issues with our clients because we are the knowledgeable ones when it comes to boundaries. Boundaries are something that we learn and are socialized to have in our family of origins. We're not born understanding boundaries. And so you'll notice in your client work that a majority of your clients will actually present with collapsed or porous loose boundaries. So that's why it becomes pivotal that you have very, very clear boundaries in your client-worker relationship. So understandably, your clients won't have awareness of the need for boundaries, and so this leaves them very vulnerable to boundary violations in a counselling or worker relationship. When we talk about dual relationships in community services or counselling, we're referring to a situation where there are multiple roles that exist between a worker and their client. And so where possible, workers are encouraged to avoid having dual relationships with clients, as this compromises the client-worker relationship and boundary violation becomes a real risk. So an example of that is as an educator with Australis, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to socialise with my students who are currently enrolled, because that generates a dual relationship. The fact that I teach you, I assess you, means that there would be a real conflict of interest. So generally the way I manage that with students and the way it's worked in the past for me is I respect the boundaries when students are enrolled quite strictly. Like, I will not socialize or befriend my students, even though I'm really warm and friendly with them. But once they've graduated, students who Facebook me and want to keep in touch then become colleagues to me and alumni. So that then becomes appropriate because I'm no longer teaching them or mentoring them or assessing them. So let's look at the issues of transference and countertransference. And these are counselling terms, but they're used widely in community services as well. So you need to be aware of what they mean and how to manage them. Transference is something that happens when clients project their feelings, thoughts, and unresolved past issues onto you as the worker. And transference is actually something that we expect from our clients. In counselling in particular, we actually think that it's a really helpful thing to the therapy. So we kind of work with transference in session because it helps in terms of the client to work through those things. There's different types of transference. There's expert transference, where the client will come in and ask you to tell them what to do, to give them specific advice or to make decisions for them about their life. And of course, we can't do that. We can only encourage clients to explore different options and possibilities. At the end of the day, we need to empower them to be able to make decisions. Another type of transference that's really common is erotic or romantic transference. Now, if you think about working with clients and the client-worker relationship, people are coming to you at a time when they're feeling perhaps disconnected and isolated, really stuck in their lives. And so they're vulnerable. They're seeking someone who will actively listen, who will respond empathically, who'll sit with them and hold the space for them. So naturally, for clients, the boundaries might become blurred and they might actually develop a bit of a crush on you as their worker or develop loving or romantic feelings. And rather than get freaked out about this, as workers, we acknowledge that this is actually a normal experience for clients. It doesn't happen for all clients, but it does happen for some. And so one way to respond to that is to actually just acknowledge it and to normalize it for our clients. So one way that I do that is I will actually explain to my clients that it's understandable that they might be developing romantic feelings and that boundaries might begin to feel blurred, because at the end of the day, they might come to see me for counselling for 1 hour a week, and in that time, they only see one-dimensional Adri. They see Adri who's kind, compassionate, holding the space for them, exploring their issues with them and supporting them and trying to find resolution. They're not privy to two-dimensional, three-dimensional Adri. You know, Adri in her daggy yoga outfit, or Adri who gets frustrated and impatient with her kids and partner. Or so once I explain that to clients, and normalize it and take the mystery out of it, clients tend to shift out of that romantic sort of fixation. If transference becomes problematic to the point where the client says, I'm in love with you, I can't actually work with you, or they become hostile with you and go, you suck as a therapist because you're not telling me what to do, there might actually be a need to refer that client on to another worker because you've reached what's called an impasse, like a sticking point in the relationship. So that's transference. Countertransference is when we as workers project or start to impose our feelings, thoughts, and particularly our judgments or biases onto our client. So it means that perhaps when we're working with clients, they trigger our own stuff and it comes up in our sessions with clients. Understanding that that is occurring is okay. Like, all of us get triggered by clients at different times. So that's where self-awareness really clicks in, because if you're being triggered, if you suddenly sit there going, oh my God, this client is so boring, I can't wait for the session to end, it's about hearing that within yourself and kind of going, I need to do a check-in with that later on. I'm going to shelve it and come back to it after the session. And this allows you to then reconnect more genuinely with your client and kind of just check in and be able to observe what's happening for you so that you can become reattuned to your client. If the countertransference is quite significant, like if you're dealing with a client who's triggered a significant trauma for you or a loss, again, it's about honoring those feelings within your body, those immediate thoughts, and going, okay, this is coming up strongly. I'm going to put it on the shelf. This is something that I need to take to supervision or debrief with my colleague straight after this session. So there are ways to manage countertransference. You can't avoid it completely, is what I'm suggesting. But self-awareness is absolutely critical in being able to manage countertransference. When countertransference is not managed, there is a very high risk of boundary violation and of harming your clients. So let's look at this boundary violation issue. There's different ways in which we can violate our clients' boundaries. We can inappropriately self-disclose. Now, it's appropriate at times to share aspects of your private life with your clients. So generally my clients, if I'm working with parents who've been referred by the Department of Communities, they've got 3 children in care, they're working with me to be reunified with their children, one of their first questions is going to be, are you a mum? And that's them wanting to see whether I'm a credible person to be working with. So in that situation, I've actually self-disclosed appropriately and said, just wanting you to know I'm a mum. I've got 3 children aged 17, 12, and my littlest is 6. So I get how tricky parenting can be. So that's an example of an appropriate self-disclosure. It would not be appropriate for me then to go into great detail about each of my children's personalities, my relationship with my children, my own struggles perhaps with the Department of Communities, or to run the Department of Communities down. That is an inappropriate use of self-disclosure. And what occurs when you inappropriately self-disclose is your client loses trust in you. Clients intuitively know what they should know and not know about their counsellor or worker. Another issue that students often grapple with is, what about touching clients? Now, if you look at, for example, the PACFA Code of Ethics or the Australian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, clearly there are instructions that clients must never be touched. And to some degree, that is really important as a guidepost. Because in reality, in practice, clients will actually touch you. So for example, I work a lot with children. Children communicate via touch. So when a child comes into session, they immediately, if I've been working with a child for a year, there's so much rapport and connection that they come in and go, Adri, I'm so excited to see you. And they come up and give me a hug. In that circumstance, I would give them a pat on the back and go, I'm so happy to see you. So that would be an appropriate way of touching. I've had clients so distressed, they've been in the fetal position on the floor. And so one way of managing that is I've gone over and said to the client, I'm just going to come over and sit beside you on the floor. Would it be okay for me to put my hand on your back? And I wait for the client to say yes or no. So if you're going to touch clients, it is absolutely crucial that you always seek their permission, because there are clients that will never want to be touched because of past trauma issues. And I realize that touching clients is a gender issue as well. Like male clinicians that I've worked with absolutely refuse to touch their clients, whilst it's easier as females to be able to do that in our society, to be able to seek consent and to do that. In terms of touching clients, I would never pat, rub, hold their hand extensively. I would just place my hand on their back in terms of that client who was completely distressed, or just place my hand on their arm if they're really distressed. Looking at social activities with clients, it is never appropriate to engage socially with your clients. Clients will invite you to dinner, lunch, to their 21st, to their weddings. The only event that I will attend is funerals for clients and their loved ones. Other than that, I generally respond with something like, I'm really flattered that you've thought of me and to invite me to your special event, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me as your counsellor to attend. So in that way, I'm respectfully declining and role modelling professional boundaries for them. Now, at times, our clients do develop those romantic sexual fantasies about us, and so again, we can normalize that. And also, sometimes, and I haven't experienced this directly, but sometimes because we're human first, we might develop romantic feelings for a client. In that situation, I would actually find a way to refer my client on to another practitioner, because that's a form of countertransference that would be incredibly difficult to manage. And so I would take it straight to supervision and I would find a way to actually refer that client. We don't support our family or friends in terms of counselling or support work because we can't offer them objectivity. We have invested emotional interest in what happens in their lives. And so that's a rule that we all abide by in practice. In terms of exchanging gifts with clients, it depends what the intent is behind the gift. Sometimes clients will offer me a parting gift when we've terminated our work, and maybe we've been working for 2.5 years, and so they might buy me a book, or but it depends on the actual gift they give me, the timing of the gift, whether I receive it or not. I don't tend to give clients gifts. I tend to give them cards for their birthday or if we've finished work together. Let's look at the issue of exploitation. So the use of a professional relationship to promote or advance any emotional, financial, sexual, religious, or personal needs is considered exploitation of the client. And it comes from an inherent power differential and our ability to exert influence over the client and to take advantage of their vulnerability. So exploitation occurs because a client might actually initiate it and be gratified by the exploitation, and maybe that's about their collapsed boundaries. Maybe they have some type of payoff in terms of feeling special or helpful. Exploitation can also be really subversive and subtle and promote sort of dependency in the client-worker relationship. And it might involve using information that you find out about your client for your own personal gain. So appropriate boundaries reduces the risk of client exploitation. Let's look at duty of care principles. We have a duty of care to always act in the best interest of our clients. And as workers, we are ultimately responsible for managing boundary issues. So 2 principles guide our work with clients and also help to reduce client exploitation. The do no harm principle and the best interest of the client principle. So questions to ask yourself when you're examining potential boundary issues is this in my client's best interest? Whose needs are being served here? How would I feel telling a colleague or my supervisor about this or my program manager about this? How would this be viewed by the client's family or someone else? Does the client mean something special to me? Is there countertransference, in other words? Am I taking advantage of my client? Does this action benefit me instead of the client? So they're really good guidepost questions that help us to engage in reflective practice and to do a check-in in terms of the relationship alliance and whether it's healthy or not. So in dual relationships, we start to really blur boundaries, which increases our exploitation of clients. So risk of client exploitation increases in dual relationship situations. So this is a note to self. Most cases of sexual exploitation, psychological exploitation, or other ethical violations began with a step into a seemingly innocent dual relationship. So that's interesting. So in terms of minimizing risk of exploitation and boundary violation, we need to be alert to potential conflicts of interest. We need to ensure that we're attending supervision, that we're consulting with our peers and colleagues, that we're discussing any ethical issues in case management meetings or staff meetings. We need to be aware that isolation is a major factor in ethical violation. So when we're feeling disconnected in our personal lives and we're not seeking support from our friends, family, or even counsellors, that we're at risk of boundary violations. That we meet our own personal needs in other areas of our life, not our client time. That relationships have to be client-focused, not self-focused. And that we have a clear understanding of ethics and that we attend to our professional boundaries. So as workers, we must always maintain a high level of professionalism. Clients are not aware of the need for boundaries, so we need to role model those. And we need to understand the inherent power imbalance that occurs in the client-worker relationship. So I hope that this PowerPoint has brought to your attention the importance of having personal boundaries and professional boundaries, If this has raised your awareness in terms of reflecting on the content we've covered, of you having collapsed, porous, or rigid boundaries, then what a great opportunity to actually reflect and look at options to better build healthier boundaries for yourself before you actually go into client work. So I hope it's been helpful to look at this work together. Thanks for listening.